Harlem, New York. White Rock Baptist Church. Sunday, September 2nd, 1973. Over 500 guests filling the pews. Stretch limousines lined up for 3 full blocks. Private security positioned at every entrance. The champagne flowing like water. The flowers imported from 3 different countries. The wedding cake standing 7 feet tall and costing more than most Harlem families earned in a year. The bride's dress covered in so many diamonds that it sparkled under the church lights like a disco ball. The groom's tuxedo custom-made in Italy, flown to New York specifically for this occasion, worth more than a new Cadillac. And Frank Lucas, the most successful heroin dealer in New York City history, the man who'd built a $52 million per year drug empire by cutting out the Italian mob and importing pure heroin directly from Southeast Asia, standing at the altar in front of God and 500 witnesses, celebrating his marriage to Puerto Rican beauty queen Juliana Ferrate, with a wedding so extravagant, so ostentatious, so impossibly expensive that it would directly lead to his arrest, his conviction, and the complete destruction of everything he'd spent 15 years building. The wedding wasn't just expensive. Expensive would have been $50,000 or maybe $100,000. This wedding cost over $1 million in 1973 dollars. That's approximately $7 million in today's money. For a single day, for one ceremony and one reception. Frank Lucas spent more money on his wedding than most people would earn in multiple lifetimes. And he did it publicly, flagrantly, with absolutely no concern about who might be watching, who might be taking notes, who might be wondering how a man who claimed to be a simple businessman could afford to spend $1 million on a party. The ceremony itself was relatively traditional. Frank and Juliana exchanged vows in front of Reverend Samuel Proctor, a respected Harlem minister who had no idea he was officiating the marriage of the city's biggest drug kingpin. The church was packed with Frank's associates, his family, Juliana's family, and various Harlem celebrities and business people who'd been invited because Frank wanted to demonstrate his status, his wealth, his position as one of Harlem's most successful men. But it was the reception that revealed just how disconnected from reality Frank Lucas had become, how convinced he was of his own invincibility, how certain he was that no one could touch him, no matter how brazenly he displayed his wealth. The reception was held at the Plaza Hotel's Grand Ballroom, not a restaurant in Harlem, not a club, not some discreet location where wealthy criminals traditionally celebrated important occasions away from public scrutiny. Frank Lucas rented out the Grand Ballroom at the Plaza Hotel, one of the most prestigious venues in New York City, a place where high society held their events, where politicians and celebrities and old money families celebrated their milestones. And Frank Lucas, a black man from North Carolina who'd built his fortune selling heroin, walked into that space with 500 guests and proceeded to throw the most expensive, most public, most attention-grabbing wedding reception in New York criminal history. The food alone cost over $100,000. Frank hired the best caterers in New York, demanded a menu that included lobster, caviar, imported steaks, delicacies that most of the guests had never even heard of before. There were ice sculptures, elaborate floral arrangements that were changed out 3 times during the reception to keep everything looking fresh, a full orchestra playing for the first part of the evening followed by a famous soul band for dancing. The bar served only top-shelf liquor, bottles of champagne that cost $500 each in 1973, cognac that was older than most of the people drinking it. Frank had hired professional photographers and videographers to document everything, not understanding or not caring that he was creating a permanent record of wealth that couldn't possibly be explained by legitimate business income. But the most shocking display of wealth, the detail that would later be discussed in every newspaper article and every court document, was Juliana's dress. Not the wedding dress she wore during the ceremony, which was expensive but relatively modest. The dress she changed into for the reception, a custom-designed gown that had taken 6 months to create, covered in so many diamonds and precious stones that it required 2 assistants to help Juliana move around without falling over from the weight. The dress alone cost $125,000, more than most Americans earned in 5 years, for a dress that Juliana would wear for maybe 4 hours before changing into something more practical for dancing. Frank gave his new wife a wedding gift during the reception, presented it to her in front of all 500 guests because he wanted everyone to see his generosity, his wealth, his ability to give his woman anything she wanted. A full-length chinchilla fur coat, pure white, so long it dragged on the floor, so expensive that the furrier had required a $50,000 deposit just to begin working on it. Frank draped that coat over Juliana's shoulders in front of everyone, kissed her while flashbulbs popped, and announced that this was just the first of many gifts he'd be giving his wife, that Juliana Lucas would have everything she'd ever wanted, because Frank Lucas took care of his family. The guests ate and drank and danced until 3 a.m. Frank circulated through the crowd, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, playing the role of successful businessman who'd made it big through hard work and smart investments. Some of the guests knew the truth about where Frank's money came from. They were part of his organization, worked for him distributing heroin throughout New York and New Jersey, had gotten rich themselves through their association with Frank. But many of the guests didn't know. They were legitimate business people, community leaders, family members who believed Frank's cover story about real estate investments and nightclub ownership and various other business ventures that supposedly generated his wealth. And outside the Plaza Hotel, taking notes and photographs, were 2 detectives from the New York Police Department's Special Investigations Unit. Detective Richie Roberts and his partner, who'd been investigating Frank Lucas for over a year, trying to build a case against a drug dealer who seemed untouchable, who operated with such sophistication and such careful security that traditional investigation methods hadn't been able to penetrate his organization. Roberts had known about the wedding for weeks. One of his informants had mentioned it, described the preparations, the expense, the public nature of the celebration, and Roberts had immediately understood that Frank Lucas was making a catastrophic mistake. Because the #1 rule of successful criminal enterprise is simple: don't attract attention. Don't let law enforcement know you exist. Don't give them a reason to look at you, investigate you, dedicate resources to building a case against you. Successful criminals are boring. They live modestly, spend carefully, maintain the appearance of ordinary citizens who happen to have slightly better cars or slightly nicer homes, but nothing so extravagant that it raises questions about income sources. The moment you start living like a millionaire while claiming to be a small business owner, you're inviting investigation. You're giving law enforcement a thread to pull, a discrepancy to explore, a reason to start examining your finances and your activities and your associations until they figure out where the money actually comes from. Frank Lucas understood this principle. He'd operated under that philosophy for years. When he first started importing heroin from Southeast Asia in 1968, when he built his organization and established his distribution network and began generating millions of dollars per month in revenue, Frank was careful. He bought a nice house, but not a mansion. He drove nice cars, but not Ferraris or Bentleys. He dressed well, but not in ways that screamed wealth. He'd watched other drug dealers get arrested because they couldn't resist showing off their money, buying jewelry and fancy cars and throwing parties where they literally threw cash in the air while people scrambled to pick it up. Frank had considered those dealers stupid, had believed he was smarter, more disciplined, more strategic in how he displayed his wealth. But something changed in Frank Lucas between 1968 and 1973. Maybe it was the sheer amount of money he was making. So much cash that it became difficult to conceptualize, difficult to hide, difficult to not spend on increasingly extravagant purchases. Maybe it was the power, the knowledge that he controlled the heroin supply for a significant portion of New York City, that hundreds of people depended on him for their livelihoods, that he'd accomplished something no black gangster had ever accomplished before by cutting out the Italian mob and establishing a direct pipeline from source to street. Maybe it was the success of his security measures, the fact that despite running a massive drug operation for 5 years, law enforcement hadn't been able to touch him, hadn't been able to build a case, hadn't been able to get anyone in his organization to flip and provide testimony. Whatever the reason, by 1973, Frank Lucas had convinced himself that he was untouchable, that he was smarter than the police, more careful than other criminals, too well protected and too sophisticated to ever be caught. The wedding was the ultimate expression of that arrogance. Frank Lucas wasn't just getting married, he was making a statement. He was telling everyone, law enforcement included, that he'd won, that he'd beaten the system, that he could do whatever he wanted, spend whatever he wanted, live however he wanted, and there wasn't a damn thing anyone could do about it. He was wrong, catastrophically, completely, irreversibly wrong, and the evidence that would eventually convict him and send him to prison for 70 years started accumulating the moment he walked into the Plaza Hotel for his $1 million wedding reception. Detective Richie Roberts wasn't at the wedding by accident. He'd been investigating Frank Lucas since 1972, had spent 18 months trying to figure out who was importing the pure heroin that had flooded New York's streets, driving down prices and driving up addiction rates, and making the Italian mob's heroin look like garbage by comparison. Roberts knew the heroin was coming from somewhere in Southeast Asia, probably Thailand or the Golden Triangle region, but he didn't know who was importing it, how it was getting into the country, or who was distributing it once it arrived. The operation was too tight, too professional, too carefully compartmentalized for traditional investigation methods to penetrate. But Roberts had learned about Frank Lucas from an informant who'd mentioned that a major Harlem dealer was getting married, throwing a huge party, spending money like he was printing it himself. And Roberts had done what good detectives do. He'd showed up with a camera and a notebook and started documenting everything. Every guest who arrived in a limousine, every person who walked into that reception wearing jewelry worth more than a car. Every associate of Frank Lucas who was stupid enough to attend a public event where law enforcement could photograph them and identify them and begin building profiles and looking for vulnerabilities. Roberts took 247 photographs that night. Some were of Frank and Juliana, catching them in moments of celebration, documenting the dress, the coat, the obvious wealth on display. But most of the photographs were of the guests. Roberts photographed everyone who entered and left the Plaza Hotel, created a visual record of Frank Lucas's organization that would later be used to identify key players, establish relationships, demonstrate the scope and structure of the distribution network. Those photographs would become exhibits in Frank's trial, would be shown to juries as evidence of the wealth generated by heroin trafficking, would help prosecutors argue that Frank's claimed legitimate income couldn't possibly support the lifestyle documented in those images. But the photographs weren't even the most damaging evidence collected that night. The most damaging evidence was financial, because the Plaza Hotel required payment. They didn't let people use their grand ballroom for free. Frank Lucas had to pay for the venue, pay for the catering, pay for everything, and he had to pay in a way that created records. He couldn't just show up with a suitcase full of cash. He had to write checks, had to use bank accounts, had to create a paper trail connecting himself to an expenditure that would later be calculated at over $1 million total when all costs were included. And that paper trail was exactly what Detective Roberts needed. Because once you have one financial discrepancy, you can pull that thread and follow it backward through bank accounts and tax returns and declared income and business records until you understand where the money actually came from. Frank Lucas claimed to be a real estate investor and nightclub owner. Those businesses, according to his tax returns, generated maybe $100,000 per year in legitimate income. You can't spend $1 million on a wedding when you only make $100,000 per year. The math doesn't work, which meant the money came from somewhere else, which gave Roberts legal justification to dig deeper, to get warrants, to examine Frank's finances in detail until the heroin operation was revealed. But Frank Lucas didn't think about any of this on September 2, 1973. He was too busy celebrating, too convinced of his own intelligence and invincibility to understand that he was committing suicide in slow motion. He danced with his wife, drank expensive champagne, accepted congratulations from 500 guests, and believed he'd won, believed he'd achieved everything he'd wanted: wealth, power, respect, a beautiful wife, a lifestyle that most people could only dream about. He went home that night, presumably to some expensive hotel suite or maybe to his mansion in Teaneck, New Jersey, exhausted but satisfied, believing he'd thrown the perfect wedding, believing he'd demonstrated his status as one of New York's most successful men. The investigation intensified immediately. Roberts used the wedding as leverage to convince his superiors to dedicate more resources to the Frank Lucas case. He argued that anyone spending $1 million on a wedding while claiming to make $100,000 per year was obviously involved in major criminal activity, probably drug trafficking given the pure heroin flooding Harlem's streets. He got authorization for wiretaps, for surveillance, for financial investigation, for all the tools that law enforcement uses when they're building a case against a major target. Within 3 months, Roberts had identified most of Frank's key associates. He'd figured out the basic structure of the organization. Frank importing heroin from Thailand using connections in the U.S. military, the heroin arriving in the United States hidden in various shipments from Southeast Asia, Frank's brother and cousins cutting and packaging the heroin in a facility in New Jersey, a network of distributors moving the product throughout New York and New Jersey. Roberts didn't have all the details yet, didn't have enough evidence for arrests and convictions, but he had the framework. He understood how Frank's operation worked, understood who the key players were, understood what he needed to prove in order to take down the entire organization. Within 6 months, Roberts had a cooperating witness, one of Frank's lower-level distributors who'd been arrested on unrelated charges and offered a deal, testify against Frank Lucas and serve minimal time, or refuse to cooperate and spend the next 20 years in prison. The distributor chose cooperation, provided detailed information about how Frank's heroin distribution network functioned, identified other members of the organization who might be vulnerable to pressure, gave Roberts the foundation he needed to start building a prosecutable case. Within 9 months, Roberts had enough evidence for a warrant. On January 28, 1975, approximately 16 months after Frank Lucas's $1 million wedding, law enforcement executed coordinated raids on Frank's home, his business locations, and the homes of his key associates. They found cash, they found heroin, they found records documenting the operation's finances. They found everything they needed to charge Frank Lucas with operating a continuing criminal enterprise, conspiracy to distribute heroin, and multiple other charges that carried a combined sentence of over 70 years in federal prison. Frank Lucas was arrested in his mansion in Teaneck, New Jersey. Detectives knocked on his door at 6 a.m. Had served him with a warrant and informed him that he was being charged with running one of the largest heroin distribution operations in American history. Frank apparently didn't say much. He'd known this was coming, had understood for months that law enforcement was closing in, had watched his organization slowly disintegrate as people got arrested and started cooperating. But he still seemed surprised when it actually happened, still seemed to believe on some level that he was too smart, too careful, too sophisticated to ever be caught. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of Frank's heroin operation, testimony from cooperating witnesses, financial records showing massive unexplained income, photographs from the wedding demonstrating wealth that couldn't be supported by legitimate business activities, wiretap recordings of Frank and his associates discussing drug shipments and distribution logistics, physical evidence including heroin seized from Frank's facilities, and cash seized from his homes. The defense argued that Frank was a legitimate businessman being targeted by law enforcement because of his race and his success, that the prosecution's witnesses were criminals trying to reduce their own sentences by lying about Frank, that the evidence was circumstantial and didn't prove Frank was actually involved in heroin trafficking. The jury didn't buy it. After deliberating for less than 3 hours, they returned guilty verdicts on all charges. Frank Lucas was sentenced to 70 years in federal prison, effectively a life sentence for a man who was 44 years old at the time of sentencing. His assets were seized, the mansion, the cars, the businesses, everything. Juliana was charged as a co-conspirator, eventually convicted of conspiracy charges and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Frank's brothers and cousins and key associates all received substantial prison sentences. The organization that had generated $52 million per year at its peak was completely destroyed, dismantled so thoroughly that it essentially ceased to exist, and all of it traced back to one decision: Frank Lucas's choice to throw a $1 million wedding in September 1973. If he'd gotten married quietly, if he'd kept the celebration small and private, if he'd maintained the low profile that had protected him for the first 5 years of his heroin operation, Detective Richie Roberts might never have had justification to intensify his investigation. The case might have remained low priority, might have languished for years while Roberts worked on other investigations, might never have generated the evidence needed for prosecution. But Frank couldn't resist showing off, couldn't resist demonstrating his wealth and his power and his status, couldn't resist proving to everyone, including law enforcement, that he'd won, that he'd beaten the system, that he was untouchable, and that arrogance, that need to be seen and recognized and celebrated, destroyed everything he'd built. The $1 million wedding wasn't just a party, it was evidence. It was a statement of wealth that couldn't be explained by legitimate income. It was probable cause for investigation. It was the beginning of the end. Frank Lucas would later describe the wedding as the biggest mistake of his criminal career. In interviews decades later, after he'd served his prison time and been released and become a cautionary tale about the dangers of criminal arrogance, Frank acknowledged that the wedding put a target on his back that he could never remove. He'd known better. He'd understood the importance of maintaining a low profile. He'd watched other criminals get arrested because they couldn't stop showing off their money. But success had made him stupid. Success had convinced him that he was different, smarter, more sophisticated than those other criminals who got caught. Success had made him believe he was invincible. The wedding also destroyed his marriage. Juliana served her prison sentence, was released, and eventually divorced Frank. She later said that the attention, the investigation, the arrests, the trial, the prison time, all of it had destroyed whatever love they'd had. That the marriage that started with $1 million celebration ended in federal prison, with both of them serving time for crimes they'd committed together. That the dress covered in diamonds and the chinchilla coat and the Plaza Hotel reception were just expensive props in a performance that ended with them in handcuffs. Detective Richie Roberts would later describe the wedding as the break he'd been waiting for in the Frank Lucas investigation. Roberts had known Frank was dirty, had known he was moving heroin, but he hadn't been able to prove it. The wedding gave him probable cause to dig deeper, gave him justification to request resources and authorization for surveillance and wiretaps, gave him the financial discrepancy he needed to follow the money trail back to its source. Without the wedding, Roberts might have eventually caught Frank anyway. Drug dealers always make mistakes eventually, but the wedding accelerated the timeline, gave Roberts the thread he needed to pull that unraveled Frank's entire operation. The story became legend in law enforcement circles. The $1 million wedding that destroyed a drug empire. The dealer who was so arrogant, so convinced of his own invincibility, that he essentially invited law enforcement to investigate him by throwing the most expensive, most public party in New York criminal history. Police academies use the story as a teaching example. This is what happens when criminals get too comfortable, when they stop being careful, when they let ego and arrogance override common sense and strategic thinking. But the story also resonated in criminal circles, became a cautionary tale about the dangers of showing off. Old-school gangsters tell younger criminals about Frank Lucas and his $1 million wedding. Use it as an example of everything you shouldn't do if you want to stay free. Don't attract attention. Don't show off your money. Don't throw parties where law enforcement can photograph your entire organization. Don't create financial records that can't be explained by legitimate income. Don't make it easy for the police to build a case against you. Stay quiet, stay careful, stay low profile, and maybe you survive. Act like Frank Lucas, throw $1 million wedding, and you're guaranteeing your own arrest. Frank Lucas spent 12 years in federal prison before being released in 1981. He was rearrested in 1984 for attempting to restart his heroin operation, convicted again, and spent another 7 years in prison before being released for the final time in 1991. He spent the last decades of his life as a minor celebrity, giving interviews about his criminal career, consulting on the movie American Gangster that dramatized his story, living off the notoriety of being one of America's most successful and most famous drug dealers. He died in 2019 at the age of 88, having outlived most of the people he'd worked with, most of the cops who'd chased him, and most of the addicts who'd bought his heroin. And in every interview, every documentary, every conversation about his life and his crimes and his eventual arrest, Frank Lucas would mention the wedding, the $1 million mistake, the party that proved he wasn't as smart as he thought he was, the celebration that put a target on his back that he never managed to remove, that led directly to his arrest and conviction and imprisonment and the complete destruction of everything he'd built. September 2nd, 1973. White Rock Baptist Church and the Plaza Hotel, a wedding that cost over $1 million, 500 guests celebrating a drug dealer's marriage while detectives took photographs and notes that would later be used as evidence in the trial that sent Frank Lucas to federal prison for 70 years. A single day that changed everything. A celebration that became a crime scene. A wedding that proved the old rule that every successful criminal eventually learns too late. The moment you stop being invisible, the moment you attract attention, the moment you make law enforcement notice you, you've already lost. You just don't know it yet. Frank Lucas knew it by January 1975 when they arrested him in his mansion. Knew it during his 6-week trial when prosecutors showed those wedding photographs to the jury. Knew it when the judge sentenced him to 70 years in federal prison. Knew it during 12 years behind bars when he had nothing to do but think about all the mistakes he'd made, all the decisions he wished he could take back, all the moments when arrogance had overridden intelligence. But he knew it first on September 2nd, 1973. Even if he didn't admit it to himself at the time. Stay standing in that grand ballroom at the Plaza Hotel, champagne in hand, beautiful wife at his side, chinchilla coat worth $50,000 draped over her shoulders, diamonds reflecting light like a disco ball, 500 guests celebrating his success. And outside, in the darkness beyond those expensive windows, Detective Richie Roberts taking photographs, taking notes, beginning the investigation that would end with Frank Lucas in federal prison and his $1 million wedding, remembered not as a celebration, but as evidence. As the moment a successful drug dealer made the catastrophic decision to show everyone exactly how successful he'd become, and discovered too late that some victories are better kept secret.